Tragically, a family of 4 went missing while trekking in the mountains. They were believed to have been victims of a hiking mishap. But then, 3 weeks later, footage from a wildlife camera shows something that everyone is wondering what occurred, and the truth is shown to be far darker than anyone could have expected. Another cold front was promised as the wind whistled across Montana's Glacier National Park. The gondola disembarked as Eleanor Whitaker, better known as Ellie, ascended the snow-covered path in her worn hiking boots. She had the sure-footed confidence of someone who had walked these mountains for decades, even though she was 67 years old. As she peered over the hazy mountain trail ahead, her keen eyesight belied her advanced years. She was more familiar with these routes than most, so she wasn't worried about the low visibility. As a park ranger and outdoor survival instructor for more than 30 years, she had walked them, taught on them, and rescued people from them. She straightened her bag and headed for the lodge that looked like a cabin, which was a landmark for hikers. Its chimney curled smoke as its wooden frame held firm against the mountainside. A familiar face glanced up from behind the counter as she set her heavy load down in the foyer and stamped the snow off her boots. "Miss Whitaker," the cashier at the neighborhood store asked with a smile. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." Ellie rose to her feet and said, "Hello, Tom," her voice betraying her determination. Tom lowered his voice and leaned forward. Ellie shook her head in disapproval, her wrinkles becoming more noticeable as she asked, "Any news about your family?" The park rangers and employees all knew her as Eleanor, the old ranger, but to the general public, she was just another legendary figure. The esteem she had acquired throughout her 30 years of service was further strengthened by her renown for guiding women's survival retreats in retirement. "Not yet," she said, taking her coat zipper off. Tom gave a somber nod and said, "That's why I'm back." The tragedy that befell the Whitaker family was known to all in town. The family of Ellie, who consisted of Daniel, Rachel, and their twin daughters Ivy and Run, had gone missing for about 30 days. Every family's worst nightmare had begun with an ordinary weekend hike. Ellie retrieved a number of posters advertising missing persons from her bag. As a family of 4, they were depicted in the top one beaming. Daniel wore a stocky green sweater, Rachel a loving smile, and the twins, Ivy and Run, wore vibrant yellow and purple, respectively. Their matching grins exposed the same spaces where their baby teeth had fallen out. "I was hoping to put these up, replace the old ones," she said, gesturing slightly with the stack extant. Of course, all around the lodge and at the trailheads, Tom responded confidently. "Anything to help. The manager already approved it. He said to tell you if there's anything else we can do, just ask." Ellie stated, "Thank you," expressing her gratitude for the care she has received at this difficult time. Pinging posters to bulletin boards and doorways as she made her way through the lodge, Ellie couldn't help but mentally repeat the events of that day. When Daniel called to ask her to go hiking with him, it was just another ordinary Saturday morning. In a jocular tone, he had remarked, "Come on, Mom," while on the phone. The girls had been asking for their grandma Ellie's stories all week. The charity event she had committed to months ago could not be rescheduled, despite her desire to attend and her near cancellation of other commitments. She was very passionate about the cause of outdoor education for disadvantaged youngsters, and it was a fundraiser to support that cause. Next time, she had once pledged. The person had complied with the request to take lots of pictures for me. By noon, she had already begun arranging booths for the charity event when her phone beeped with a message from Daniel. Against the mountainous background, the 4 of them smiled widely, making for the ideal family portrait. Noticing that they had always taken it at the same area, she smiled. Rachel had previously stated her intention to film a time-lapse of the girl's childhood set against the backdrop of the immutable mountains. At the time, it appeared to be a very heartfelt and lovely notion. Ellie got home from the charity event a few hours later and saw that Daniel had missed multiple calls. "Weather turning bad up here, cutting the hike short. Talk later." Along with the text message, she attempted to contact him back right away, but the call went to voicemail. So did Rachel's phone. Ellie had initially reassured herself that there was no need to be concerned, using the park's famously unreliable phone coverage as an example. Worry became to dread as night fell and they still hadn't returned. The police had been contacted by her that evening. Early in the morning, search groups began scouring the paths that were utilized most often. Many community volunteers recognized Daniel from his days as a little boy chasing after his mother, a ranger, on the less dangerous trails, and they turned out in large numbers to support him. Ellie was not going to accept what the police had to say after a week of hard searching, with helicopters scanning from above and teams on foot below. Day by day, the chances of locating them alive were dwindling. Ms. Whitaker, the search coordinator, had said gently, "We've covered every likely area at this point. With the weather systems that move through, I'm sorry, but we have to consider the possibility of a tragic accident." However, Ellie knew that her son Daniel was known and respected in these mountains for his experience and the dangers they provided. If he had been paying attention, he would have known to take shelter or turn around before things became worse, and he would never have risked his family's safety. Ellie went back to the mountain even though the police had reduced their search efforts. Something had transpired that went beyond a routine hiking disaster. If no one else could locate her loved ones, she would take matters into her own hands. Her trembling fingers betrayed her intention to distribute further flyers at the trailheads as she braved the chill of the outdoors. She took great care to fasten each poster so that they would not be blown away by the wind. Each one brought back the image of Daniel's last photo, where the family was smiling and oblivious to what was to come. Gazing intently at the posters, a youthful pair strolled by. Over the past few weeks, she had become accustomed to those eyes before they moved to Ellie's face with recognition and sympathy. However, her family would be found by determination, not by pity. After Ellie had fastened the posters at the main trailhead, she raised her gaze to the cloud-covered mountaintop. The solutions were waiting for her up there, and she would discover them in the end. Along the hiking trail, Ellie persistently posted posters asking hikers if they had seen her family. She would stop walkers as they passed to inquire. Sympathetic looks, shaking heads, and murmured wishes for a good ending were the same in every discussion. When Ellie heard the 20th, "No, sorry," she nearly gave up hope of ever receiving a positive response. At that moment, a figure materialized from the underbrush to her right as she fastened a flyer to a trail marker approximately 2 miles ahead. A man in his 50s, striding purposefully, wore camouflage and an orange safety vest as he approached her. He yelled out, "Excuse me," as his breath matched the chill of the air. "Would you mind if I grab one of those?" Ellie murmured as she pivoted to admire him. A thick beard streaked with gray and sharp eyes that appeared to register everything around him gave him the worn appearance of someone who spent more time outdoors than within. "Absolutely," she responded, extending a flyer toward him. "My name is Cal Jennings," he introduced himself, offering a gripped hand. "Local hunter. Been coming to these mountains for 30 years. He was shook by Ellie's hand. He said, "Eleanor Whitaker. My friends call me Ellie." A look of recognition raced across his face. With a furrowed brow, Cal scanned the flyer closely. "The ranger heard a lot about you over the years. Respect what you've done for the park. When did you say they went missing?" 3 weeks ago. Almost a month now." Cal retrieved a little gadget from his jacket pocket. I think I should check something. I've got trail cameras set up for tracking game movements." Ellie's heart rate rose. "You think you might have caught something? Maybe worth looking." It looked like a collection of images and videos were playing on the screen as Cal scrolled through them. As he zeroed in on certain areas, his movements grew more measured and careful. Ellie eagerly inquired, "What is it?" her hopelessness becoming apparent. "Did you see something?" Instead of responding right away, Cal kept watching the clip, pausing every so often to glance at the flyer he was holding. His finger lingered over the screen as he froze. He tilted the gadget in her direction and said, "Miss Whitaker, I think you should see this." A woman with shoulder-length hair and 2 little children cautiously made their way through the underbrush, and Ellie's heart nearly stopped when she saw them on the hazy, mist-covered footage. Children sported yellow and lavender garments, while the woman sported a jacket of a lighter shade, perhaps coral or pink. "That's them," Ellie murmured with a hint of surprise in her voice. Nodding gravely, Cal said, That's Rachel and the twins. The date and timestamp in the screen's upper right corner indicated that the footage had been shot only 3 days ago, which led me to believe it might be. 3 days? Ellie asked, her voice quivering with a mix of astonishment and anticipation. They're alive. But where's Daniel? My son should be with them. To get the best shot possible, Cal cranked up the magnification. This is a fixed camera. It only captures what passes directly in front of it. Your son could have been walking behind them, or he might have taken a different route. There's no way to tell from just this. Ellie drank in the sight of her family as she peered at the frozen image. The weary and trembling figures advanced with the measured pace of travelers traversing uncharted territory. The camera was probably well hidden for its original function of following wildlife surreptitiously. At one time, they had turned slightly toward it, but didn't appear to notice it. With a sense of urgency, Ellie said, "Where was this taken?" she inquired. On his device, Cal accessed a GPS map. "Here," he said, gesturing toward a designated spot. "It's deep in the northern section, about 8 miles from where we're standing now. The terrain gets rough up there, lots of unmarked ravines, unstable slopes." As Ellie analyzed the map, a revelation started to sink in. That's outside the search zone. The police never went that far north because they said it was too dangerous. No maintained trails, high avalanche risk after the storms we had. Exactly. Not somewhere a family with young children would typically venture, which is why no one thought to look there, she said. "Cal, I need a copy of this footage. I need to show it to the police immediately." As he began to transmit the file, Cal nodded. He wrote on a little notebook, "This is my number. Call me if you need anything else. I know those northern reaches pretty well." He then said, "I can email it to you right now." This was followed by an email. In an emotionally charged, "Thank you," Ellie spoke. "This is the first real lead we've had in weeks." "I hope it helps," Cal responded, "and I hope you find them safe." Once the file transfer was complete, Cal looked at his watch. He pointed to his hunting bag and said, "I need to head back down. It's getting late, and I've got what I came for already. Will you be all right?" Ellie shouted, "Yes," as she clung desperately to her phone, containing the priceless clip. "I'm going back to my cabin to call the police right away." As they descended, the trail became more manageable as they made their way to the lodge. Fresh opportunities galore flooded Ellie's thoughts. As of 3 days ago, her family was still alive. The search would now have to be restarted, forcing the authorities to reevaluate regions that were previously ignored. They arrived at the lodge, and Cal lowered his hat in her honor. "Remember, call if you need anything. Good luck, Miss Whitaker." Ellie responded, "Thank you, Cal," as she watched him walk into the parking lot. With renewed resolve in her stride, she swiftly made her way to the cabin she had leased. After weeks of despair and hopelessness, she finally felt something. As soon as Ellie stepped foot in her cabin, she reached for her phone and dialed 911. With a tiny quiver in her fingertips, she carefully traveled to her family's case's lead officer, Detective Marshall, has her saved contact information. "Detective Marshall speaking," was the immediate response. She attempted to maintain a calm voice as she introduced herself as Ella Laner Whitaker. Ellie described the encounter with Cal Jennings and the location of the footage as she said, "I found evidence that my family is alive." The detective took a moment to gather his thoughts before asking, "What kind of evidence, Miss Whitaker?" Ellie's explanation included video footage from a trail camera, which showed Rachel and the twins moving through the forest just 3 days ago. "I'm going to send you the video right now," she said, continuing as she pulled up her email. Marshall analyzed the film while Ellie walked the cramped cabin, looking out the window at the waning daylight. "You need to see this, Detective. We need to restart the search immediately. At this time of year, the mountains experience a rapid descent into darkness, and it was almost 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It seems like these are your granddaughters and daughter-in-law," Marshall finally said after a little pause. "However, Miss Whitaker, we can't begin a search operation this late in the day." "What do you mean?" said Ellie. As a former park ranger, Marshall responded with a measured tone. "I understand your urgency, but nighttime search operations in this terrain are particularly dangerous. The area you're describing is particularly treacherous, Ellie shifted to the window and watched as park rangers were already guiding day hikers back down the mountain trails. More snow was on the way as dark clouds gathered over the mountains. Major snowfall is expected tonight, Marshall went on to say. We must not place teams into uncharted areas where visibility is low and weather is getting worse. Doing so would simply increase the number of possible casualties, he said. Ellie felt his agony, but she understood he was correct. She had been on enough rescue missions to grasp the procedures and their rationale. What about helicopters? She inquired, desperately seeking alternatives. Under these circumstances, and especially not in the dark, Marshall responded. Furthermore, based on what I can gather from this footage, it doesn't seem like they're in immediate danger. Their movements are deliberate, unlike individuals who are seriously hurt or disoriented. Ellie said, sinking into a chair as she battled the excruciating pain of knowing her family was nearby, but still unreachable. Are we going to sit tight until morning? I asked. At first light, Marshall answered. Ellie sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the frozen image of Rachel and the twins on her phone. I understand, she said reluctantly, but I want to be part of the search team. Given your experience, I think that could be arranged. Just be at the ranger station by 6 a.m. Ellie ended the call and coordinated with the park authorities. We will assemble teams and plan the safest approach to that area. Miss Whitaker, I promise you we will do everything possible to find them tomorrow. They were still breathing, but something seemed off. Has Daniel disappeared? I don't understand why he wasn't in the video with them. Ellie recognized her son, despite Cal's reasonable argument that Daniel might have been in another scene or on a different path. Leaving his family behind in hostile, isolated territory was something he would never do, particularly with twins in tow. He was too watchful and overprotective. Plus, what brought them to that particular location in the first place? Not only were they well off the path they normally followed, but they were also in an area where even seasoned hikers were warned of danger. Without a strong justification, Daniel would never have taken his family there. She was already worried, and the questions kept piling up without providing any relief. Standing up and making her way back to the window, Ellie watched as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first snowflakes fell. Another night alone in the forest awaited her family up there as the darkness descended. Hold on, she murmured, her breath obscuring the icy pane of glass. As night fell over the mountain, Ellie's hut became more and more cramped, but she told herself, just hold on until morning. The walls pressed in on her, and the stillness made her nervous thoughts all the more pronounced. Even though the little fireplace was keeping her warm, she felt a shiver that was unrelated to the weather. Not having eaten since morning, her tummy grumbled. Ellie checked her watch and saw that it was 6:30 p.m., so she made plans to attend the lodge's community meal in the main hall. She wouldn't benefit from spending the night alone with her worries. Braving the chilly weather, she crossed the courtyard and approached the main structure. The snowstorm had accelerated, with big flakes falling in the illumination of the outside lights. All sane hikers had long since made their way back to safety, leaving the paths deserted. As she drew nearer to the lodge, she noticed a cluster of people congregating in the middle hall around the massive stone fireplace. Through the glass doors, one could hear the sound of talk and every so often laughter. For most of these folks, it felt brutally ordinary, just another evening in the mountains. But for Emily, her world remained turned upside down. Ellie was met with an overwhelming sense of warmth and the aroma of cooking as she pushed through the doors. Conversations froze for an instant before picking up with an air of feigned casualness as heads turned as she walked in. Over the past few weeks, she had become used to being whispered about. She retrieved a cup of hot water from the beverage station and reached into her pocket for an instant noodle cup. Seated on the periphery of the gathering, she was neither fully immersed nor entirely isolated. Two males were chatting close by when she became aware of it. Their ages were comparable to hers or slightly older. During the brief pauses in the main discussion, they spoke more quietly yet clearly. They all agreed that Ella Whitaker was the one. The second person responded, yet to the question about the millionaire woman, It is unfortunate that her family went missing after she donated all that money to the Wilderness Education Foundation last month. Karma can be cruel. The first man went on, oblivious to Ellie's ability to hear him. I will be searching right this second, he said, disregarding Storm. Absolutely, she said. Well, she's just a woman and she's doing this alone, the other person said, being polite. The steam rising from Ellie's cup of noodles warmed her expressionless face as she peered into it. Thinking can't be easy at her age. Many around her persisted in their chats, but they gave her room and nodded courteously when they saw her. I would go out there looking right this second, Storm be damned, but all she could think about were those words. If she went lost on the mountain, would Daniel be patient until morning? No, he wouldn't stop looking until he located her. That was the instant response. Ellie redoubled her efforts to eat only enough to keep herself from being too hungry, and then she stealthily left the party. Returning to her cabin, she was alone as no one paid her any mind. She entered the room and proceeded deliberately. Her trusty hiking gear, including thermal layers, a waterproof shell, and reinforced boots, had seen her through innumerable outdoor hardships, so she retrieved it from her baggage. The emergency supplies, first aid kit, and survival gear from her previous search and rescue bag were still neatly organized. Make sure you have both online and offline maps installed on your GPS device. She double-checked it. The precise location of Cal had already been marked. Along with her Sub-Zero sleeping bag, she brought along spare batteries and energy bars. A still, quiet voice warned her that she was being careless while she worked. When the sun rises, the cops and park rangers will begin their search. With the weather getting worse, she faced perilous terrain at the age of 67. However, a more authoritative voice, the same voice that had led her for 30 years of wilderness rescue missions, reminded her that in survival situations, every hour counts. Furthermore, she was the only one who could have safely traversed these mountains under those challenging circumstances. Having fastened her pack, Ellie crept out of her hut, being very cautious not to be noticed along the major paths. More snow was falling, and it was starting to pile up on the ground. Not wishing to attract attention as she passed the cabins in the faint light, she removed her flashlight from her pocket but turned it off for the time being. She stopped at the trailhead to get her bearings as soon as she arrived. Following Cal's GPS directions, she had to go northwest, away from the paved roads, and into the forest where fewer people go hiking. The hike will be difficult even when the sun is shining. Every talent she possessed would be put to the test as the darkness and blizzard intensified. She was determined to locate her family, though, who she knew were out there. Ellie started her climb after turning on her headlamp and inhaling the crisp mountain air. As she walked, her boots crunched through the snow and her breath became little clouds in the frigid air. The lodge's echoes grew fainter as she walked, giving way to the rustle of snow and the rustle of wind in the pines. The path became less clear as the terrain became steeper. She had been hiking for 2 hours when the snow began to fall so thickly that she could see barely a few feet in front of her. As she continued on her journey, her frequent GPS checks ensuring she was on track, the passage of time appeared to take on less significance. The temperature continued to drop as the hours ticked by. The snow was blown horizontally by the gusting wind, which pricked any exposed flesh. Numbness spread to Ellie's lips, and, even with her insulated gloves on, her fingers were rigid. She suddenly realized that she was very close to her breaking point. Finding shelter and waiting out the storm would be her only option if the weather continued to worsen. A subtle light peeked through the snow as she pondered her alternatives for establishing a makeshift camp. It was her tiredness or the brightness that first made her question its veracity. However, when she cautiously advanced, the light turned out to be a window, light streaming out of a building tucked away amid the trees. This secluded forest area has a cabin. Cabins were constructed by some. An overwhelming sense of hope washed over Ellie as she stumbled through her weary frame. It provided some protection from the worsening storm, at the very least. Ideally, it would reveal something about her family. Her headlamp illuminated a modest, strong structure partially obscured by the surrounding woods as she cautiously approached. A plume of smoke curled from the chimney, signaling the presence of an occupant. Knocking on the wooden door, Ellie's hands quivered. From cold or anticipation, she couldn't tell. It was unanswered. Still nothing until she rapped harder on the door and yelled out, "Hello, is anyone there? Please, I need help." The silence lingered for what seemed like an eternity. Next, the door swung open with a creak, saving her from the need to knock a third time. Ellie stared into the eyes of a stranger whose likeness she had only ever seen in pictures and on missing person posters for the previous 3 weeks. Incredulous, Rachel remained still as she stood in the threshold. Neither of the women budged for an instant. Subsequently, Rachel appeared to regain consciousness and hurriedly drew Ellie inside. As Rachel helped her mother-in-law remove her outer layer of snow, Ellie finally spoke out. "Ellie, what are you doing here?" Rachel stumbled over her words. From further into the cabin, Ellie heard hushed voices that interrupted her. "Mom, who is it?" Ivy and Run, 2 little girls, looked up from behind a wooden chair frame. Their expressions changed when they recognized their grandma. They all shouted out, "Grandma Ellie," as they hurried closer, then paused abruptly, as if they were suddenly timid or unsure of themselves. Overwhelmed with emotion and fatigue, Ellie collapsed to her knees. She felt numbness and tingling spread through her limbs as the cabin's fire warmed her icy extremities. When she saw her granddaughters alive, the overwhelming sense of relief overwhelmed the physical pain. Rachel hurried to the cramped kitchen and came back with a mug that was scalding hot. "Here, drink this. You're half frozen." Ellie drank the warmed liquid, which was actually powdered milk, and then it hit her. The twins were led by Rachel back to their improvised bed. The twins trudged to a little bed in the corner, where they curled up under a thick blanket, reluctantly. "It's late, girls. Back to bed now. Grandma Ellie is tired and needs to warm up. You both can talk to her tomorrow." Following their enthusiastic consumption of the milk, Rachel tucked them in with the deft touch of an expert, muttering a word that elicited gentle chuckles from the children. "Good night, Grandma Ellie," Ivy said to her grandmother. Just as Run was about to yawn with her eyes half closed, she repeated the words. Ellie was taken aback when one of the females started to drift off right away. Not long after that, they began to breathe more steadily and gently. They felt the day's exhaustion melt away as the blanket's warmth and their companionship brought them tranquility. After the first shock wore off, Ellie's head was filled with questions, but the most urgent one quickly made its way to her lips. Saying softly so as not to wake the twins, she asked Rachel, "Rachel, where's Daniel?" Rachel's expression darkened as she heard Daniel's name. At the center of the hut, on the small wooden table, she dropped onto a chair and motioned for Ellie to do the same. While Rachel sat down, Ellie slid into the chair across from her, her hands still warming the coffee. A single room with a kitchenette, the tiny bed where the twins slept on, and a leather sofa made up the cabin, which was basic but solid. Along one wall were shelves that contained supplies including canned goods, bottled water, and basic tools, while a tiny wood burner served as both a heat source and a cooking area. Ellie spoke up again, this time demanding to know what had transpired and where her kid was. Weeping welled up in Rachel's eyes. Before responding, she calmly spun her own mug between her hands while staring down at it. She started to say, "We had an accident," but her voice was hardly audible. "That day, we went hiking. We failed to properly check the weather forecast. As a result, we were caught in that terrible snowstorm 3 weeks ago, but why were you up here?" Ellie said, her voice quivering with anxiety. "This area is marked as dangerous on all the park maps. Daniel knows better than to bring children into this zone." Rachel took a bite. "He wanted to try something different. We've been hiking the same trails for years, and the girls were getting bored. He thought we could just explore a little ways into the less traveled areas, stay on the lower slopes where it's safer. But then the storm hit so suddenly. Going back seemed more dangerous than pressing forward." She took a moment to wipe her eyes. Nodding, Ellie understood how a shelter in such conditions would have been a gift, but she still didn't have her answer. "We were lucky to find this cabin. It saved our lives that first night," she asked, "and Daniel?" "Next." Rachel's expression drooped, and she froze for an instant. Grief shattered her voice when it returned to her. The next morning, when the snow had let up a little, Daniel said he would hike out to get help. He thought if he could reach an area with cell service or find a park ranger. She let out a breath. I waited. Hours turned into a day. Another storm moved in, worse than the first. I couldn't leave the girls alone to go looking for him. Did you ever find him? Ellie inquired, her voice trembling with fear. The tears were flowing freely as Rachel shook her head. I attempted to search the area after the second storm passed, but the twins made it impossible. Then more bad weather arrived, and now we're stuck here, waiting for the weather to improve so we could try to get back to the main trails. Ellie's heart felt like it was being squeezed. She began to say, "So Daniel is," but she stopped short. After 3 weeks, Rachel confessed, "I don't know for certain. I've had to accept that She hid her face in her hands and shook her shoulders. Ellie finally asked the question that had been bothering her ever since she got there after a brief pause. Rachel asked, "Do the girls know?" as she drew back, clearly trying to compose herself. Ellie cast a sidelong glance toward the small bed where her granddaughters slept, their matching faces expressionless in the dim cabin light. They did eventually. They're smart, always asking questions. By the second week, they knew something was very wrong. I had to tell them that Daddy might not be coming back. She felt terrible for them as she worried about how they would handle the terrible news. Ellie turned back to Rachel and questioned, "But why did you stay here?" Rachel's face turned pale as she asked, "It's been 3 weeks. Surely there were breaks in the weather when you could have tried to make it back down." I was afraid. Maybe if it was just me, I might have risked it. But with the twins, after losing Daniel, she gave a shrug. Ellie got up from her seat, feeling an overwhelming need to get up and move around. I couldn't bear the thought of something happening to them, too. So we stayed, using the supplies we found here. She went over to the kitchen and took a closer look at the cabinets there. Canned beans, soups, and veggies made up the bulk of the diet. On the other hand, there were dried milk and beef containers that appeared to be in reasonably good condition. "These supplies don't seem to have been sitting here for years," Ellie commented, taking up one of the milk boxes. "No," Rachel agreed. "It seems like this cabin is used on a regular basis by someone. Perhaps a hunter. We should be good for a while longer." Ellie placed the milk on the table and went to throw away her used cup. A gleam of metal beneath a loose floorboard caught her sight as she approached the small garbage can near the door. She knelt down and looked around more carefully. What did she say? "There's something under here," she whispered. Rushing over to her, Rachel got to her feet in a flash. Ellie lifted a floorboard and asked, "What is it?" as she inserted her fingers into the space between the boards. With little effort, it lifted out to expose a little aperture beneath. A man's wedding band featuring an unusual diamond inlay lay buried in the dirt. Lifting it out, Ellie's breath caught. The ring appeared spotless, devoid of any blemishes or grime that could be expected if it were had been buried for a considerable amount of time. She spoke in a hollow, disbelieving voice, claiming this to be Daniel's wedding ring. For an unintelligible minute, Rachel gazed at it before she snatched it. A hasty, "It must have fallen off his finger that first night," was her response. As Rachel placed the ring on her thumb to keep it secure, Ellie handed it to her and said, "We were all so cold and our hands were numb. It probably fell through the crack without him noticing." Even though Ellie knew something was off with the explanation, she couldn't put her finger on it. Once again, she took note of the cabin's characteristics that she had previously overlooked, such as the large amount of chopped firewood outside the door, much more than one would expect from an abandoned cabin, and the slightly ajar cupboard behind Rachel, which revealed not only canned items but also fresh supplies. "Rachel," Ellie remarked in a quiet voice, "if this cabin is abandoned, why is there so much firewood? And those supplies, some of them look new." Rachel's face briefly fluttered with a mix of fear and shame before she grew calm. "I told you, I think someone uses it regularly. Maybe they've been by since we've been here, and they didn't see us. We hide when we hear anyone approaching," said Rachel. "After everything that's happened, I didn't know who to trust." Ellie gave a subtle nod, but the explanation failed to allay her mounting anxiety. With further inquiries in mind, She pivoted back toward the kitchen when out of nowhere, she saw movement in her periphery. Rachel was standing behind Ellie, arms raised high, holding the butt of a hunting shotgun in her hands, just as the agony was about to burst across her brain. Then she was consumed by night. Painful pieces of consciousness resurfaced to Ellie. A constant pulse of pain emanating from the base of her skull began with a pounding in her head. After that, she became acutely conscious of the cold. Even though she was inside the cabin, her limbs felt dead. The last thing she could stand was the stench, a sharp chemical odor that made her voice raspy. Refusing to be disoriented, she blinked her eyes open and forced herself to open them. As the fire died down to embers, it cast long shadows on the walls of the cottage, turning it dark inside. She could observe the snowstorm's passage through the windows, which revealed a starry night sky beyond. She felt a wave of terror wash over her as she attempted to move, and her limbs froze in response. As she glanced down, she realized the reason. She was shackled to a chair made of wood by ropes that were so tight they sliced into her flesh. She began to cough as the odor intensified. In the cabin, gas started seeping out. As Ellie looked for Rachel and the twins, her eyes raced all over the room. The little bed in the corner was deserted, with the covers scattered on the floor. In the cabin, nobody else was present. Rachel had abandoned her bound and gagged in a cabin that was about to explode from the gas, and the reality struck her with a savage clarity. This was supposed to be Ellie's death scene. But for what reason? Ellie knew she couldn't give in to the question's intensity at this moment, even though it was as searing as the agony in her brain. Life itself was paramount. She surveyed her surroundings. Snug but not precisely knotted, the cords encircled her wrists. She might be able to break free if she could just make enough slack. The chair was old, but it was robust and would not break easily. Ellie started to test the chair's stability by rocking it, starting with little motions. With every movement, she endured excruciating waves of anguish in her brain, yet she persisted. She was in a rush and couldn't afford to waste time as the gas smell intensified. She lurched forward all of a sudden, sending the chair tumbling to one side. She felt the chair creak ever so slightly, but the force jolted her hurt head and blurred her vision. With renewed vigor, she hammered the chair repeatedly on the floor until one of its legs snapped. Ellie managed to free her bound hands and reach for her pocket because to the slight give in the framework caused by her broken leg. After a few excruciating seconds of fumbling, her fingers finally wrapped around the small folding knife she always had on hand, despite being stiff from cold and restricted circulation. It was an absolute task that demanded all her ability to open it with one hand while chained. She cautiously began sawing at the ropes around her wrists as soon as the blade clicked into place. She felt her head spinning from the strong gas scent. A tiny flame, kindled by the fading embers, caught something somewhere in the lodge. A gentle whoosh resounded as flames sprang up close to the hearth. As the first flames raced across the wooden floor toward the kitchen area, the rope around one wrist gave way. Ellie swiftly untied her ankles and freed her other wrist, accelerating her task. She felt lightheaded from standing, but her adrenaline drove her further. The door was locked when she stumbled to it. She was unable to discern if it was with a key or by some external means. Now the fire was devouring the old wood with ravenous efficiency as it was swiftly expanding. Ellie reached for one of the last logs of firewood and walked over to the closest window. A woman who had spent decades building the physical strength necessary for outdoor survival would find the old, single-pane glass particularly susceptible. She leaned the wood against the glass, grunting as she did so. Glass broke, but remained intact. It took another strike before it broke, scattering pieces across the snow. To remove the remaining glass from the frame, Ellie used the log, disregarding the cuts that appeared on her hands while she worked. The blaze had progressed to the kitchen from behind her. When the flames met the gas at its most concentrated, a horrific explosion shook the room. A puff of air, followed by a flash of lightning that scorched her hair and propelled her on. Without hesitation, Ellie went through the window, despite the fact that the shards of glass caught on her garments and sliced her leg as she twisted and turned. Her fall into the snow outdoors, a stark contrast to the fire behind her, occurred as she eked her way through the cramped area. She rolled away from the cabin and watched as it went up in flames. What had appeared like a comforting warm glow just hours ago now shown itself to be a lethal trap. Everything she needed, including her supplies, GPS, backpack, and ways of communication and navigation, was on fire within. She had no idea where she was in relation to the lodge, was wounded, and was out in the wilderness all by herself. However, she was still alive, and Rachel was probably running away with the twins, who were born to Ellie's son Daniel, the man Rachel had likely murdered. That reality couldn't be ignored by Ellie. Why had Rachel attempted to murder her when she began to ask too many questions if Daniel's death had really been an accident? The pain that rushed through Ellie's leg where the glass had wounded her made her stumble to her feet, and she writhed in agony. At this point in the night, the sky was starry and the stars were clearly visible above the tree line. The North Star helped her get her bearings, and she remembered that the lodge was west of the cabin. But a high-pitched, terrified child's cries rang out from the depths of the forest, interrupting her as she was about to go in that way. With her feet buried in the thick snow, Ellie pushed herself toward the sound, oblivious to her own wounds. Reappearing, this time with more clarity, the voice was clearly that of one of the twins. She continued to follow the cries as she made her way through a forest of pine trees and eventually came out into a clearing. A tiny purple-jacketed person crouched against a rock outcropping. One leg stuck out at an odd angle. "Run," Ellie whispered as she cautiously approached, taking care not to terrify the toddler anymore. Tears streaming down the girl's cheeks, she glanced up. As Ellie knelt down next to her granddaughter to examine the wound, the latter cried out, "Grandma Ellie, it hurts." "My leg really hurts." Ren had a severely sprained or fractured leg, and her ankle was swelled to twice its normal size, even in the faint starlight. Ellie removed her scarf to build a splint and inquired, "What happened, sweetheart?" "Ivy and your mom aren't here," Ren said with a sniffle. "Mom tried to help me after I fell down the hill, but she insisted we keep going," she said, the child's voice cracked. A level of fury that Ellie had never felt before washed over her as she cried out. She said something about sacrifice, and then she took Ivy and left me here. Even though she would have died from the cold by morning, Rachel had left her wounded daughter in the forest. "I'm here now," Ellie attempted to say in a soothing voice. "I'll find a safe place for you," she said as she delicately fastened the splint around Ren's ankle, immobilizing the joint with branches and her scarf. After that, she cradled the baby in her arms and held her close to her bosom. She told herself, "It's going to be okay," as she turned toward the road she thought would lead back to civilization. As Ren encircled Ellie's neck, her body quivering with fear and cold, she yelled out, "Hold on tight. We have a long walk ahead of us," as Ellie set off on the perilous descent of the mountain. Each step bearing valuable goods, she discovered new sources of strength despite her own wounds and fatigue. With an injured child to safeguard, no map to guide her, and years of expertise in these mountains under her belt, she possessed an iron will that would not be swayed by fear, exhaustion, or agony. Ellie would ensure that the woman never hurt another member of her family again when she and Run arrived at safety, while Rachel was somewhere ahead escaping with Ivy, with Ren's weight in her arms serving as a continual reminder of the stakes. Ellie pushed forward despite the fact that the descent of the mountain was an excruciating test of endurance. Her entire body ached for rest. As her weariness gave way to agony, the kid slipped into a restless sleep, letting out a few whimpers here and then. In the dark, Ellie relied on starlight and her memories to guide her, taking care to avoid obstructions and avoiding steeper slopes when she could. A slip at this point could have disastrous consequences for both of them, so they had to think carefully about every move. As the stars slowly moved across the sky, hours passed in this manner. Ellie could make out well-known sights as the first signs of dawn lit up the eastern horizon. They were drawing near to the well-kept paths that would take them back to the inn. "Run," she whispered, reawakening the young lad. The girl shifted, her eyes glancing around groggily, and said, "Look, sweetie, we're almost there." Pain and cold had turned her face pale, but she caught sight of the path markers ahead, and a glimmer of hope emerged in her eyes. With a tiny, unsure voice, she inquired, "Is Mom there?" Ellie wasn't expecting that inquiry. How could she tell a 7-year-old that their mother had attempted to murder them both and left Run to die in the snow? Truthfully, she said, "I don't know," but she continued, "But there are people who can help us, and that's what matters right now." They continued their journey past the outlying cabins and into the center lodge. From their vantage point above the tree line, Ellie could observe staff members arranging equipment and early morning trekkers getting ready for the day. "Help! We need help here," she cried out, drawing on her last power. Instantly, heads turned, and after a moment of stunned silence, people started rushing toward them. Ellie collapsed to her knees in the snow when her legs finally gave out from under her, but she kept her protecting embrace on Ren. "Call the manager and get medical help," someone yelled out. Ellie was helped to her feet as others delicately removed Ren from her arms. As they were led into the lodge, the welcoming atmosphere of the foyer embraced them, and the sounds of worry and bewilderment mixed with each other. A voice said, "It's Eleanor Whitaker," and one of the missing children, the manager of the lodge, then emerged. As he recognized her, a look of amazement crossed his face. Interrupting, Ellie asked, "Miss Whitaker, what happened? How did you call the police?" Her voice betrayed her profound fatigue. "Rachel attempted to assassinate me, and she abandoned Run to perish in the snow, his injuries visible to all." The assembled multitude fell silent. Ellie no longer cared about privacy, even if others had started filming the scene on their phones. "We need to warm them up," the manager stated, regaining his calm. "And the child needs medical attention immediately." They were led to the main room's massive fireplace, where blankets materialized out of nowhere and around their shoulders. While another employee provided warming beverages, one with first aid expertise started to examine Ren's hurt leg. "Miss Whitaker," the manager stated as he crouched down next to her. Ellie completed his sentence. "The gondola operators saw a woman with a child early this morning. They weren't sure, but they thought it might have been Rachel." He asked which way the woman was going down the mountain, and Ellie said, "With Ivy, it seemed like they were moving fast and talking to no one." Ellie's spirits plummeted. Rachel might be in any place at this very moment if she had already descended the gondola. The arrival of emergency services was signaled by the piercing sound of sirens. Police officers and paramedics quickly filled the lodge. Paramedics carefully transported Run to a stretcher while monitoring her vital signs and stabilized her leg. Ellie adamantly stated, "I want to stay with my granddaughter," as they got Ren ready to be moved. Assuring her, of course, was one of the firefighters' jobs. "We'll transport you both to the hospital." A police officer walked up to them as they were being carried onto the medical helicopter, which would take them to the nearest hospital the fastest. "Miss Whitaker, we must have your statement immediately. We have already received contradictory information," Ellie stated, refusing to release her grip on Ren's hand. "What do you mean?" Ellie inquired. Arriving at the hospital earlier, a woman claiming to be Rachel Whitaker was discovered with a toddler at the park's main gate by a hunter. "Some very serious accusations have been leveled against you by her." Ellie looked at the cop in shock. "What kind of allegations?" "She claims you tracked them to a cabin where they'd been sheltering after her husband's disappearance. According to her statement, when you learned Daniel was presumed dead, you became enraged and attempted to harm her and the children. That's absurd," Ellie responded, fury giving her a boost. "She knocked me unconscious and left me to die in a cabin filling with gas. She abandoned Run with a broken leg in freezing temperatures," the law enforcement officer nodded. "Let's gather at the hospital," Ellie stated firmly, "because the child, Ren, needs medical attention more than you do right now. We'll need formal statements from both of you and her when she's able." The officer then retreated as the helicopter crew fastened the doors. Watching the mountainous terrain fade away as the chopper took off, Ellie clutched Ren's hand tightly. She had reconnected with her family, tragically lost her son once again, and narrowly avoided death at the hands of his wife in the span of a few hours. This same woman was now trying to cast Ellie in a negative light by manipulating the story. Ellie was incensed at the idea of Rachel harboring Ivy, who would be mentally harmed by being exposed to her own twin sister and grandma. A worried look crossed Ellie's face as the paramedic overseeing Wren's condition. Ellie nodded absent-mindedly as the physician examined the wound at the back of her skull. "Ma'am, I need to check your injuries, too. You have lacerations that need cleaning and possible concussion from the blow to your head." She couldn't stop thinking about what lay ahead at the hospital. Rachel's deceit, the court system's responsibility to determine truth from fiction, and the devastating responsibility of explaining what had happened to her family to her grandchildren. "Grandma Ellie," Wren said in a quietly audible but distinct voice. As Ellie drew nearer, she gently brushed the child's hair away from her forehead and whispered, "I'm scared no matter what obstacles came her way." She was determined to honor her vow to her beloved. "I know, sweetheart, but I'm right here with you, and I'm not going anywhere." Nurses hurriedly made their way from room to room. Doctors checked patient records, while worried relatives waited impatiently for word on loved ones. With a bandage covering her wound on the back of her head and smaller dressings on her cut hands, Ellie sat outside the radiology department. She sustained a moderate concussion, according to the physicians, but no skull fracture. Ellie was left waiting as her granddaughter received X-rays to assess the severity of her injuries. They had planned to keep her overnight for monitoring, but she had insisted on being admitted to the same floor as Wren. Ellie wasn't sure if the police officer was standing by her side to keep her safe or to make sure she stayed still. For preliminary medical evaluations, they had been temporarily separated after the chopper touched down. There was a noticeable increase in tension when more officers showed up during that period. When the elevator doors swung open, she recognized the hunter who had given her the surveillance footage, Cal Jennings. Approaching the officer with a solemn attitude, he nodded politely before turning to Ellie. "Cal." Ellie scrutinized his face, attempting to decipher his intentions. "Miss Whitaker, I heard what happened up on the mountain. I'm glad you're safe." He looked at the police officer and then returned to Ellie, saying, "Thank you for coming, but I'm surprised to see you here. I need to talk to you and to the police. There's something I have to tell you both." A doctor appeared from the radiology department, tablet in hand, before she had a chance to answer. "Miss Whitaker, your granddaughter's X-rays show a clean break to the tibia. She'll need surgery to properly set the bone and place pins to hold it in position while it heals. When can you do the procedure?" Ellie said as she got up. Ellie agreed, saying, "I want to see her first." The doctor escorted her back into the department where Wren lay on a stretcher, her leg immobilized and in four in her arm. "We're preparing an operating room now. We'll need a consent form signed, and then we can proceed." Ellie placed her hand on the girl's and confirmed, "That's right. They're going to put you to sleep so you won't feel anything. When you wake up, your leg will be in a cast, but it will be on the right path to healing." The girl's expression brightened slightly as she spoke to her grandmother, her small but courageous voice conveying the news that her leg would be fixed. "Does Mom want to sign the paperwork?" While Rachel was in the same hospital as the minor, the legal situation was complicated, so Ellie wasn't sure how to respond. The doctor cleared his throat and said, "In emergency situations involving minors where guardianship is unclear, we can proceed with treatment that is medically necessary with the consent of available relatives." This left Ellie unsure of how to answer and uncertain of how to proceed with the medical procedures. "Your signature will do for the time being, Miss Whitaker, considering the circumstances." She felt a wave of relief as she said, "Thank you. I'll sign whatever you need." Cal took a deep breath as he began. "First, I want to say how sorry I am for everything that's happened. What I have to tell you is not easy." Ellie steeled herself. "Just tell us the truth," Cal nodded grimly. Ellie returned to the hallway where Cal and the officer were waiting, having promised Wren she would be there when she woke up. The officer led them to a small consultation room, where two other police officers were already waiting. "It had been 3 weeks since I discovered Rachel, Daniel, and the twins in my cabin. After becoming entangled in the storm, they stayed the night. After venturing into that area, Daniel elaborated. The weather turned, and we couldn't make it back safely. This is your cabin, right? Is that your hunting cabin? Ellie cut in. Of course, I've owned it for quite a while. No official maps included. The girls were too scared and tired to leave, so I let them stay at the house that I had constructed on a secluded piece of land, Cal explained. I left them there for solitude, planning to return to the lodge myself, but the weather worsened. Daniel assured they'd leave once circumstances improved and the girls felt better. Cal hesitated, apparently struggling with his next words. Hailstorms were approaching. I turned around and heard what sounded like children's cries. I followed the sounds and watched Rachel shove Daniel off a cliff edge. The room was silent, and everyone was staring at Cal as he pushed himself to keep going. A fatal fall occurred. Nearby, concealed behind woods, were the twins. Rachel insisted that they remain where they were, and Ellie's palm instinctively went to her mouth as a choked gasp from her throat. It was awful to have her suspicions validated. What gave you the gumption to wait to report this? Cal, you saw Rachel watch me. One of the cops demanded. Cal Schulder's dropat. I was frightened for the children's and my own safety on the cliff and in the weather, so I refrained from confronting her. She then made me an offer once we returned to the cabin. She would give me enough money to retire and vanish if I let her and the kids to remain hidden in my cabin until someone found them naturally. The beneficiary of Daniel's life insurance, she claimed, would pay her bills. While he continued, I'm embarrassed to confess I thought about it, even agreed to it at first. He avoided looking Ellie in the eye. Over the course of 3 weeks, I delivered them food, fuel, and whatever else they could need. $2 million, Ellie said. That was the amount declared on Daniel's life insurance policy. Rachel said her husband had recently consulted a lawyer about changing his will, creating trust fund for the twins in case of his death or divorce, but the paperwork wasn't finalized yet. Cal nodded. Rachel is the primary beneficiary, but only if Daniel died while they were still legally married, with no criminal charges or proven intent. So what changed? Said one of the officers who leaned forward. Now is not the time to come forward. Why? You lent Mrs. Whitaker a hand, but why? The sight of those missing person posters and the kids' grief over their father weighed heavily on Cal's conscience, among other things. The deciding factor, though, was listening in on Rachel and her lawyer's phone conversation. To keep the money for herself, she intended to make me look guilty in Daniel's death. It was at that moment that I realized I couldn't continue to be involved, he said to Ellie, his face betraying his sincere regret. I apologize for not guiding you to them when you show me the poster. Both fear and egotism consumed me. My alarm was sounded this morning when I noticed Rachel and a single child descending the mountain. I contacted the authorities at that point. She killed my son, Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. And you helped her cover it up. Ellie stared at him, a complicated stew of emotions swirling within her. Appreciation that he had ultimately helped save Run, anger that he had shielded Rachel for so long, and disgust at his eagerness to profit from her son's murder. No matter what punishment is handed down to me, I will accept it, because I know, Cal said. I simply could not bear it any longer, said one of the officers. Mister, we are going to arrest you, Jennings, for being an accessory after the fact to homicide. You have the right to remain silent. As the officer continued reading Cal his rights, Ellie tried to process everything she had learned. Daniel hadn't died in a tragic accident trying to save his family. He had been murdered by his wife in cold blood, with his children nearby as witnesses. The officers handcuffed Cal and prepared to lead him out. Before they did, he turned back to Ellie one last time. For what it's worth, Miss Whitaker, I truly am sorry. You would never have discovered your grandchild if I hadn't come forward. I hope you can forgive me someday. Ellie briefly raised her hand, appearing ready to strike him, before lowering her arm to her side. You're correct about one thing. I might never have found Run and Ivy without you. I appreciate that. After Cal was carried away, the lone officer briefed Ellie on what was to come. We're moving to arrest Ms. Rachel Whitaker now. Ellie understood that she couldn't offer forgiveness at the moment. Based on the information we have gathered from the children and Mr. Jennings' testimony, we have sufficient evidence to press charges of first-degree murder and attempted murder against her. And what about Ivy? Where has she gone? Ellie inquired. A child advocate has her in a secure room. The contradictory testimonies were brought to our attention, so we have kept Rachel distinct. Just then, someone tapped on the door, and a nurse peeked in, staring directly at Ellie. "Ms. The operation on your granddaughter was successful, Whitaker. Thanks to all the hard work, she is now on the road to recovery." The cop got to his feet and said, "I need to join my colleagues." "Thank you." Ellie's voice betrayed her pleasure. She had finally found a silver lining to today's otherwise cloudy day. "Now we will legally arrest Rachel and read her rights in her room. Would you prefer not to be here?" Ellie considered for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I need to look her in the eye." They walked together down the corridor to another wing of the hospital. Outside a room guarded by a uniformed officer, several police officials were gathered, speaking in low tones. They acknowledged Ellie with respectful nods as she and the officer approached. "We're ready." The lead detective said. "Ms. The detective formally began. "Rachel Whitaker, you're under arrest for the murder of Daniel Whitaker and the attempted murder of Alina Whitaker and Ren Whitaker. You can observe, but please allow us to handle this officially." Ellie agreed, and they entered the room. Rachel lay in a hospital bed, with an IV in her arm and monitors tracking her vital signs. Her expression hardened as she saw Ellie. Ellie watched as the investigator read Rachel her rights. Rachel's expression stayed expressionless until the detective brought up Cal's evidence. "He's lying," Ellie said, fixing her gaze on the woman responsible for her son's death. "Why, Rachel?" Cal was the one who... The detective interrupted Rachel as she spat. "Save it for your lawyer." Then he continued, reading her Miranda rights. Ellie then stood up. "You were lucky to have Daniel as your spouse." Rachel's expression twisted with bitterness. "Good? Does that reflect your opinion? I discovered him having an affair with an employee of his office, and we fought about it for months. Daniel is really dishonest." "That's not him," Ellie declared with conviction. "On more than one occasion, I witnessed him meeting up with women. That friend of his always makes the same excuse about networking and business meetings," Rachel insisted. "It's quite annoying. His next move was to bring up the possibility of revising our prenuptial agreement. He had every intention of ditching me for another woman." Ellie disagreed and shook her head. "You are unaware of the complete detail. All you did was act on your darkest suspicions." "The hiking trip was supposed to fix things," Rachel continuing as if Ellie hadn't spoken. "It was a way for us to reconnect as a family." Yet he persisted in disputing the allegations and would not sever relations with his pal. "I lost it just now. So, you did it by pushing him off a cliff? With your daughters around?" Ellie demanded with astonishment. "By following us outside. They were clearly not meant to. I told them to stay in the cabin." Rachel responded defensively. An officer handed Rachel handcuffs and fastened them to the bed rail. "Ms. Whitaker, you'll remain in custody here until you're medically cleared for transport to the detention center." Rachel glared at Ellie. "This isn't over. It was over the moment you decided to murder my son," Ellie replied coldly. "You'll spend the rest of your life in prison, and you'll never see those girls again." Leaving Rachel under guard, Ellie made her way back to the recovery area, where Run was beginning to wake from anesthesia. The child's leg was encased in a cast from foot to mid-thigh, elevated slightly on a pillow. "Grandma Ellie," Run murmured groggily as Ellie took a seat beside her bed. "I'm here, sweetheart," Ellie assured her gently, taking her hand. "The surgery went perfectly. We're gonna be all right." "Where's Ivy? Is she also here at the hospital?" the girl said, her vision all over the place. "You'll see her soon, I promise." Later that evening, after Run had been moved to a regular room and fallen into a deep medication-assisted sleep, Ellie was granted permission to visit Ivy. The child was in a room down the hall, a social worker sitting quietly in the corner. Ivy looked up as Ellie entered, her eyes wide and uncertain. She resembled her sister so closely, yet the experiences of the past weeks had marked her differently, a weariness in her gaze that no 7-year-old should possess. "Hi, Ivy," Ellie said softly, approaching slowly. "Grandma, Ellie." The girl's voice trembled. "Where's Mom?" "Ren, where are you?" "Run is in another room resting," Ellie said as she sat on the side of the bed, taking care not to squeeze the infant. After treating her injured leg, she was able to walk again. She will be all right. And Mother? Ivy's bottom lip trembled as she asked, Daddy's not coming back, is he? Ellie explained with care. Your mom is with some people who are trying to understand what happened on the mountain. For now, you and Rin are going to stay with me. No, my darling. Daddy isn't going to return. Mom said he was in an accident. Ellie heard, her heart shattering all over again. But he loved you and Rin very, very much. And I'm going to make sure you always remember that. Tears welled in Ivy's eyes. Without warning, she launched herself into Ellie's arms, sobs racking her small frame. Ellie held her tightly, her own tears falling as she rocked her granddaughter. As Ivy's sobs gradually subsided into hiccups and then the even breathing of exhausted sleep, Ellie continued to hold her, thinking of all that had happened and all that lay ahead. She had lost her son, a wound that would never fully heal, but his daughters remained precious links to the man he had raised and loved. They would need her strength now more than ever, and she was determined to provide it. Ellie believed that true justice would be served when Rachel was tried for her crimes and Cal was held accountable for his part in covering up the truth. However, she believed that justice for Daniel would be served by making sure that Ivy and Run were loved and protected, and that they were not defined by the terrible deeds of one parent, even though that parent had done terrible things. Ellie silently promised her son that she would care for his daughters with all the love and wisdom she had, helping them face the painful realities of their past and creating a future full of healing and hope as the moonlight filtered through the hospital window and cast gentle shadows across Ivy's sleeping face. She had spent her entire life training for arduous treks, and Ellie Whitaker would confront this, the most crucial of them all, with the same tenacity and resolve that had carried her over the mountains for over 30 years.